Thanks, Greg, and good to see all of you this morning, this beautiful morning. As you old-timers know, this is my favorite time of the year. Fall is around the corner. Actually, I think it's here. It just feels like fall to me. And I love autumn in New England. The leaves, of course, which will be spectacular, I hope, and that we're famous for. But then that's followed by Thanksgiving, which, of course, New Englanders kind of invented, remember, not in the biblical sense. And then Christmas, which is, of course, the best of all. Plus, I just think there's something wonderful about being able to begin a new academic year, which we have done here in the last few weeks. You know, make new friends, perhaps, new classes. And this year, of course, we have got a new president. And that's kind of cool, as we've seen through this inauguration this last weekend. Dr. Lindsay is a very accomplished and inspiring human being, and it's just kind of fun to think about what might be in the days ahead. And in some ways, I think that's one of the benefits of starting again. You know, it's a chance to do things right for a change, to start with a clean slate. A whole new set of classes if you're a student, and really learn this time. That's true for professors as well, by the way. We're not teaching new classes every semester. That varies with the professor and with the season. But nevertheless, every time I sit down with a new group of students in a new year, it is kind of exciting for me. New faces, new possibilities, and then just the privilege of the thing, which is significant. So I love it, always have. From the first time I stepped into the classroom as a teacher, while I was still a graduate student at Vanderbilt, actually, I have loved the first day of class. Not always for the best of reasons, by the way. I remember in those early years of teaching being happy to start a new class because I was so glad to leave the last class behind. Sometimes it was certain students that would bug me. You know, they were about my age after all, and they didn't always appreciate my confidence. Didn't see any reason for it. But sometimes it was my own behavior, dumb things that I had done or said that I wanted to leave behind. I recall in particular the first time I lectured on race relations in an introductory course, and I've told actually a few of you this before. But you have to remember now, this was a few decades ago. The civil rights movement was in full tilt, and I was teaching in Nashville, Tennessee. And this wasn't a class at Vanderbilt, but a brand new campus of the State University downtown. I needed a little extra money. They needed someone to teach an introductory course, match made in heaven. Nevertheless, it was still a sensitive time to be talking about such issues. And the school had only been integrated a year or two before I stepped into the classroom. So I had prepared my lecture very carefully, but very much from the heart. I wanted my students to know where I stood on the thing, what I thought and why. Anyway, I gave my lecture, and it was awful, or so it seemed. I mean, nobody said a word. No one asked any questions. No one made any comments at all. They just looked at me like I was from another planet, which of course I was. I was from California, which in those days at least was another planet. But I honestly doubted that that was the problem. In fact, I was pretty sure that I was the problem. I liked the students actually, and we'd had good discussions on other days, on other issues. And so when I finished my lecture that day, I couldn't blame them. I could only point the finger at myself, and I didn't like it, the finger or myself. And of course, what I wanted to do, and what I would get to do in a few months, was to start over again. Get a whole new class with a whole new crop of students and another opportunity to do it right, put history behind me, and begin anew. Which is what we do, of course. That's what we're doing right now in this new academic season. And that's what we do all the time, whether we're starting a new class or meeting new friends or just beginning a new day. We're starting over, leaving the past behind and feeling pretty good about it. Until one day you walk into chapel and somebody reads the first few verses of Luke chapter 12, as we did just a few minutes ago. And then you wonder why in the world you decided to come to chapel today. I mean, here I was, leaving my past behind, and suddenly I hear Jesus saying, without any qualification or nuance, the time is coming when everything that is covered up will be revealed, and all that is secret will be made known to all. Whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and whatever you have whispered behind closed doors will be shouted from the housetops for all to hear. Which means, if I'm getting Jesus correctly, not only is it impossible for me to leave last year behind, but last night as well, or last weekend, or the last any time at all. Because according to Jesus, all will be revealed. Every word whispered behind closed doors will be shouted from the housetops for all to hear. And the question before us this morning, aside from why you came to chapel, is, so what? So what is Jesus really saying, for one thing? And so what difference would it make if we really believed it? The first part's fairly easy, I'm afraid. What he's saying is something we all know. Our secret lives are a complete facade, a total fiction, you might say. We think they are private. We assume all the time that what we are thinking or saying in the dark or to ourselves or just to a few others is separated, walled off from our public self. We learn this pretty early, actually, when we discover that there are certain things that our brother or sister can hear, but our parents better not. It gets even more interesting, of course, when we go off to school and gain a whole new bevy of friends who talk about things on the playground or in the locker room or wherever that we very much do not want our teachers to hear, much less our parents or even some of our friends. And it just grows from there, right? We learn, in other words, to live secret lives, to practice stealth conversations, to take advantage of the finitude of those around us for our own pleasure or benefit. But Jesus says, ain't going to happen, isn't happening. All will be revealed. And the question that keeps lurking in the back of my mind is, what difference would it make if we really believed that? If these words that we have heard many times before actually sunk in? I mean, this is not a new thought, right? This is one of those verses that parents absolutely love, in fact. At least when they're talking to their children, maybe not when they're talking to each other or at work. But at home with the kids, you love it. And so growing up, if your parents were good Bible-believing folks, this is a passage of Scripture you might have heard often. They might have even marked this one in red ink or left it open, the Bible open on the kitchen table so you could see it. But then we go off and live as if it's not true all the time, almost every day, until something happens. Until perhaps we read about a politician who was caught in a motel room where he shouldn't have been. Or hear someone talking in the next room about something that she shouldn't have known. Or receive an email from someone who shouldn't have sent it. Thought it was going someplace else, to someone else, but now it's right there, staring you in front of your face. We live in interesting times, actually, relative to this issue. And we like to complain about the information technology that inundates us with thoughts and requests of millions of people that we may or may not care that much about. But there is one interesting effect to this new age, and that is that it quite frequently reveals things that we didn't think would be revealed. Wikipedia has made a kind of an interesting living off of this, But the fact is, almost everything we plug into the internet in some way, regardless of how private or isolated it seems at the time, is available, known, out there, someplace, ready to be tapped into by the skillful user. And while that doesn't really make me very happy, it is a reminder of the reality that we all face and know deep in our hearts, especially those of us who are followers of Christ. There is no such thing as a secret. It doesn't really exist. All will be revealed, to use the words of Jesus. And the sooner we figure that out and actually live with that in mind, the better off I think we're going to be. I'm talking to myself, as you can tell. That's what most of my chapel talks are, I'm afraid, for which I apologize. But the truth is that this is something that I know theoretically, something I learned in my head when I was a fairly young boy, all the time. I'd think some terrible thought or say something to someone, and then dismiss it, and then in a day or two, the thing would be exposed. My mom was particularly good at this, interestingly. You've gotten a lot of stories about my dad over the years because he's sort of the superstar in my life, the shining example, you might say, of how life should be lived. But my mom, while not exactly a role model, as we think of that term, was the one who almost always cut me to the quick, asked the revealing question, or confronted me with that which I needed to be confronted. As I've told you before, she was the one who bluntly asked me one day, "Stanley," always knew I was in trouble when she said Stanley, but "Stanley, are you a Christian?" Just like that, totally out of the blue. It was an amazing event for which I was completely unprepared. And for that reason, forced me to confront something directly that I hadn't really confronted before, which was that I had not made a clear verbal commitment to Christ, and that it was time to do so, which I did, thanks to my mom's blunt question. Thanks be to God. So Mom was a fairly key player in this revelation business. Nevertheless, to be honest with you, I don't think it was until a few decades later, when I moved into positions of leadership, that this really came home to me. This whole matter of secrecy and hidden thoughts and conversations behind closed doors. Of course, I'd seen it in other roles as well, as a student and a parent and a friend. But it was when I got dumped into these leadership roles in the church or the community or in colleges that I got a whole new education on this matter. Now, I need to tell you right off the bat that I've always enjoyed doing such things. It's kind of exciting most of the time and fun some of the time. And even when it's painful, there's something good about working with others to accomplish something that you could never do alone. So it's a privilege, in other words, which probably accounts for my propensity to say yes when asked and to land in such a varied array of positions over the years. But such positions also confront you with some other things as well that aren't so pretty. One of which is lots of conversations that other folks want to have with you that they want to keep hidden. That is, they want you to know something, but they don't want anyone else to know that they told you. I remember one time, for example, when I was told by an unnamed member of the town in which we were living at the time something that I knew to be patently false about an employee at the college. And this person went on in a way that made them look good and this employee look bad, all for the sake of getting me to do something that would be beneficial to them. It was incredible. And I remember just kind of looking at this fellow who was talking to me with my jaw hanging open and not knowing whether I should laugh or cry or spit in his face. I mean, it was just amazing. And of course, when you leave a conversation like that, you then need to figure out what you're going to do with it, which in this case, I simply buried in the deep recesses of my mind, because if I told anyone about it, it would just make matters worse. And that's one of the hard things about being in a leadership position, by the way, because there's a great deal you come across that needs to remain with you alone, for your eyes only. So anyway, I decided to just stuff it, forget about it best I could, and go on with life. For some reason, however, life doesn't always let you do that. And in this case, I had the interesting experience of going from that meeting to one at my church, this time with one of the leaders in our congregation, and soon found myself in a very hot and heavy conversation about all kinds of people who were giving us grief. People in town, people across the street, even people in our own church. It was kind of fun, to be honest with you. And as we would trade our insults with one another and share our perceptive observations, essentially explaining all of our problems in the church by dumping on those who seemed wholly to deserve it. And deserve it they did, by the way. I knew that deep in my heart. And given that justification, when I left the meeting, when I left the meeting and then I walked back to my car, I was feeling pretty good, pretty smart actually, since I had made some very witty observations, but also kind of gleeful given the fun that we had had at the expense of others, who deserved it, remember. As I stepped back into my car, however, something rather unexpected occurred. I put the key in the ignition, pulled on my seatbelt, and then looked up to see something that was staring me in the face. And you know what it was? It was our cross. Our church had a cross in front of it, like lots of other churches. But this time, I didn't see the cross. I saw the one behind it, who had carried it, bore it, endured it for me, and was now holding it in front of my face. "What are you doing, Stanley?" he said, sounding a good deal like my mom, come to think of it. "I created these people, remember? These people you've been talking about, just like you, I created them. In my image, I created them. And you, well, you didn't like it when they talked badly about someone you love, someone from your college. So how do you think I feel when you do the same thing with people that I love in this town, in this church, in this world?" Or words to that effect. Can't remember the entire accusation, to be honest with you. All I remember is the stark realization that I had done exactly what I had condemned only hours before. And all of heaven knew about it. Here's the deal, as far as I can tell. The difference between the world that God sees and the one we try to create and manipulate for our own purposes every day is vast indeed. And we know it, all of us. We know it because we know ourselves. And we know it because we see it in the world around us all the time. Our courts are full of it, right? If you want to see humanity undressed, become a lawyer or a judge. There you are plunged into a situation where truth-telling is paramount. Getting at what really happened is the only way to arrive at a just conclusion. And yet everyone is quite intent upon not telling the truth, but employing elements of the truth to make them look innocent and the other fellow guilty. And as any judge or jury will tell you, it is quite amazing at what length people will go to keep up this charade. But it turns out the courts aren't different. They're the same. They simply put in public view that which we engage in on a regular basis every day. A few months ago, the leader of the IMF was arrested just as he was heading back to France on an airplane for allegedly sexually abusing a hotel staff member in New York City. And of course, at the time, we had no idea whether he was guilty or set up in some way. But the absolutely fascinating thing was how people jumped to conclusions, regardless of their ignorance. On this side of the Atlantic, people saying things like, "Of course he's guilty, that's what the French do all the time." And then back in France, folks saying just the opposite, complaining not about his behavior, but the audacity of these Americans treating a French leader in such a way. What no one seemed the least bit interested, there or here, was what actually happened, the truth. And that's us. We accuse or defend based on our self-interest. And if you think that is frustrating for a judge on earth, think of what it looks like to the one in heaven, the judge of judges. And think about it not in terms of those people around you who are doing all kinds of deceptive things, but relative to yourself. Think about how you look in heaven, how I look in heaven. And then think about the words of Jesus one more time. All will be revealed. What we're thinking right now will be known, is known. And we understand that, we Christians, right? Pretty basic stuff. And yet, we still pretend. Say things to others we know are not true. Saying things about other people that are designed for our benefit, not the benefit of the one whom we're speaking. And the question is, how can we do this when we know in the words of Jesus, that all will be revealed? Well, I'm not sure, to be honest with you. When something this stupid happens this regularly, one needs to be pretty careful about assuming an answer. That said, two reasons do pop into my mind, two possibilities, you might say. The first is that we don't really believe it, what Jesus is saying. And this makes perfect sense, obviously, for those who do not consider themselves followers of Christ. Non-Christians, you might say, should not be expected to believe that which they don't believe. But what about the rest of us who claim to be Christians, who believe, in fact, that this same fellow who said all will be revealed is actually the one who will reveal it, who will make all things known? He is the light of the world, in whom there is no darkness. Surely we believe in him, don't we? Maybe. But frankly, sometimes I wonder. I mean, when we live lives in opposition to that which we confess, then I confess our confession seems a little suspect. This was the problem, in part at least, with the Pharisees, it seems to me. These were the righteous ones, according to their own words, the ones who obeyed the law and were rather insistent that others do the same, including Jesus. But they were duplicitous, some of them, certainly towards Jesus, since they tried to trap him fairly frequently, talking behind his back and working with others to lure him into making some serious mistake. They would pretend to be one thing when facing Jesus and his crowd of admirers and be something quite different behind the scenes. Jesus, interestingly, was exactly the opposite. He speaks every bit as directly to the Pharisees when they're with him as when they're absent. In fact, some of his most abrasive comments about the Pharisees are made in their presence, directly in their face, you might say. This is not something he does only to the Pharisees, however, since he does exactly the same thing with his own disciples, or even those whom he meets along the way. To Peter, whom he renames the Rock, and he taps to lead the early church, he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." To Thomas, who doubted and was quite incredulous about the resurrection, he says, "Put your hands in my side." And we could go on and on. You've all read these stories, probably many times. Jesus is extraordinarily honest and straightforward, regardless of whether the audience is a governor, a scholar, an adulterer, or a Samaritan at the well. And the question that stares us in the face as those who claim to call him the Messiah is, can we do anything less? Granted, we very often do not have the knowledge or wisdom to confront one another with either the force or gravity that Jesus did, but we certainly are capable of not talking behind one another's back, of being honest on all occasions, since we know, as Jesus told us, that all will be revealed. So, what gives then? Why don't we behave more consistently according to the truth we claim to know? Well, we're all sinners. That's what you're thinking right now, right? We're sinners, only saved by grace, and so we too will fall. But can you really explain our behavior as simply momentary lapses? If so, I would be much assured, since it would mean that once noticed, we would quickly amend our ways, apologize to those we've offended, and get on with the life that we know we're called to live. But I fear that that does not describe what's going on most of the time. I remember a few years ago confronting a student who had lied to me fairly directly about something that he said he had done. Actually, in this case, he had lied to the entire class. And I was just the poor fellow who had the sad experience of uncovering the lie and needed, therefore, to confront him with his behavior. When we first got together over lunch, I was a little nervous, to be honest with you. I don't like confronting people, never have. And even though I was the old professor who's done this kind of thing millions of times, my knees were kind of shaking under the table. Eventually, however, I put down my sandwich and I looked him in the eye and I explained what I had discovered. He listened. He was silent for a minute or two. And then he did something quite phenomenal. He smiled. And then his smile turned to a grin. And in the next few minutes, not only admitted to his deceit, but then went on to assure me that it would never happen again. And oh, by the way, he was a sinner saved by grace. And wasn't it a great thing that Jesus had covered our sins, that they were removed from us as far as the east is from the west, never to be seen again. And oh, what's for dessert? Literally. I mean, in the next breath, he was talking about not only what he was going to consume at the table, but in life, his plans that night, that year, after he graduated from college. I was stunned. And as I listened to him quickly move on to the next topic and then the next, I wondered not so much about him, but about us all and about me. How different are we from him in the first place? But second, how could we think so lightly of sin? And most especially, how could we possibly use the fact that Jesus died for us, paid the price for our sins on the cross, as an excuse? Not only excusing us from bearing the rightful penalty of our sins in eternity, but excusing our foul mouths, explaining our proverbial lies and deceit, and allowing us to feel pretty good about ourselves in the process. After all, we're forgiven. What's for dinner? Something we won't like, I'm afraid. The truth is for dinner, for all will be revealed by the one who is the truth, the one who sits at the head of the table, who breaks the bread and pours the wine and says, "This is my body broken for you. Don't forget. Don't forget what I've done. Don't forget why. And don't forget the new life that comes when you have consumed, really consumed, what I have given." You remember the story I told you about the first class that I taught many years ago, and that terrible lecture on race relations that I gave that almost sent me packing, never to teach again? Well, there's more to the story. Because when I finished my lecture that day and everyone had hurried out of the room, off to much better things, I noticed that there was one student in the back who had not left, who was still there, waiting for others to leave, clearly wanting to say something to me alone. He was an African-American student who I had gotten to know over the semester, who hadn't had an easy life. He'd grown up in a segregated community, for one thing, and was one of the first in his family to go to college. But then, now you might say, had to endure this fellow student, this graduate student from California, who was about his age, pretending to be his teacher. That would be me. This fellow, who probably knew a lot less about race relations than he did, but now was in the position of lecturing him on the subject that he had lived. And as he came up to the podium where I was standing that day after everybody had left, I wondered what he was going to say, given what he knew and what I had done that day. But he didn't say much. In fact, he just looked me in the eyes and kind of knocked on the desk. and said, "You done good. You done good." And he walked out the door. That was it. A few words said in private that he obviously believed that probably saved my life and propelled me into a career that I would love as much as anything I've ever done ever since. And why did he do it? Well, because he wanted an A. That was a joke. That was a terrible, terrible, terrible joke. No, he already had an A. He was one of the best students in the class. He did it for one reason, not for the crowd. He waited till everyone was gone. Not for himself. He didn't even hang around long enough for me to thank him. He did it because he knew at that moment that I needed to hear the truth, which he believed. And I have never been the same since. Does he remind you of anyone or anything? Well, it should, because that is what the kingdom is like, with the true king and those who claim to be his disciples. And so I say to you this morning, but especially to me, go and do likewise, and know that all will be revealed. Thank you.